The most dangerous monetary shift in the world never begins with a neat announcement. It begins when crisis makes centralization feel practical. That is the real pattern. People wait for the official speech, the press conference, the law with the obvious title, the moment when power says out loud exactly what it intends to build. That is not how these systems usually advance. They advance through emergency, through justification, through convenience, through fear, through the exhausted public desire for someone, anyone, to make the instability stop. That is when the architecture changes. So let me give you the one mother line that everything in this story serves. The dollar is not replaced in one dramatic act. It is upgraded into a more centralized control system when war, debt, inflation, and digital finance create the excuse to move money from being a neutral medium into a programmable instrument of power. That is the line. Not one conspiracy cartoon, not one secret room, not one villain doing everything alone. Crisis plus opportunity, because once all the scattered pieces start fitting together. Oil shock is not only about oil. Treasury yields are not only about bonds. Stablecoins are not only about innovation. Digital wallets are not only about convenience. AI disruption is not only about productivity. Each piece matters on its own. Together they point in one direction: more centralization of money, more dependence on controlled rails, more pressure on ordinary people to live inside systems they do not own and cannot negotiate with. That is the deeper story. Now let me show you the mechanisms. The first mechanism is imperial funding stress. Reserve currency power looks permanent until the bill arrives. For years, the United States has been able to finance enormous deficits because the world wanted dollar assets, treasury bonds, U.S. equities, real estate, liquid markets. All of it made America not just a country, but a giant storage system for foreign surplus capital. That arrangement looked like strength. It was strength. It was also dependency, that is imperial funding stress. If foreign holders begin selling dollar assets, whether because they need dollars urgently for energy imports, because war disrupts trade flows, because yields move badly, or because confidence in American geopolitical protection weakens, then the entire privilege of easy financing starts wobbling. The national debt is no longer just a number. It becomes a refinancing problem on an empire scale. This matters because a country carrying almost $40 trillion of debt does not experience higher yields as an inconvenience. It experiences them as structural compression. Interest expense rises. Deficits widen. More bonds must be issued. More supply pushes yields up further. The system starts feeding its own stress. That is what people call a spiral only after it is obvious. Before it is obvious, it still looks like market noise. That is imperial funding stress. Now let us move to the second mechanism. I call it oil 2, yield transmission. Most people still underestimate what an energy shock really does. They think higher oil means higher gas prices. That is only the front door. Oil to yield transmission is what happens when an energy shock moves through inflation expectations, bond markets, and fiscal stress all at once. If a major oil choke point closes or even remains uncertain long enough, countries dependent on imported energy suddenly need more dollars to secure supply. That means selling what they already hold, often treasuries and other dollar assets, in order to obtain liquidity. At the same time, higher oil means higher inflation pressure. Higher inflation pressure means central banks have less room to ease. Less room to ease means the bond market begins demanding more yield. More yield means the debt burden itself gets heavier. That is the chain. War does not only move tanks, it moves bond markets. This is why energy crises are so politically explosive. They hit citizens through the cost of living and hit governments through the cost of funding. The public wants relief. The state has less room to provide it. Markets begin asking whether the old model can absorb another wave of strain without some larger intervention, that is, oil to yield transmission. And once you see it, you understand why geopolitical conflict can become a monetary event very quickly. Now let us move to the third mechanism. I call it inflationary rescue. When states run out of easy options, they usually choose the option that keeps the system alive today and sends the deeper cost into the future. That option is some form of monetary support. That is inflationary rescue. Letting yields spike and allowing a full debt deflation can shatter public markets, housing, tax revenues, and confidence all at once. Walking away from geopolitical responsibility can damage reserve, currency prestige, and encourage the world to reduce dependence on your money. That leaves the most politically attractive option: suppress the damage with liquidity. Some version of quantitative easing, yield control, emergency asset purchases, or indirect monetary accommodation. This is where the story gets dangerous. Printing into an oil shock is not the same thing as printing into a cold financial collapse. If the economy is already facing energy-driven inflation pressure, more liquidity can turn a solvency problem into a currency problem. The debt market gets temporary support, but the money itself becomes less trustworthy. The surface stabilizes, the deeper foundations weaken. That is inflationary rescue. And this is one of the oldest tricks in power. Save the visible structure now. Let everyone pay later through inflation, dilution, asset repricing, or higher dependence on the system you just expanded. That is why people often feel that every crisis ends with more control concentrated above them, because it often does. Now let us move to the fourth mechanism. I call it debt upload. This is where the modern financial system becomes more creative. A government with too much debt has only so many honest options. Tax more, cut spending, default directly, inflate it away, or find more holders. Debt upload means pushing government debt outward into broader structures so that ordinary people, institutions, and eventually global users become indirect financiers of the state, whether they think of themselves that way or not. This is not always sold as sacrifice. Usually it is sold as innovation, access, yield, modernization, or convenience. That is the genius of it. People do not line up eagerly to fund a stressed sovereign balance sheet for patriotic reasons alone. They will line up if the debt is wrapped inside a payments app, a rewards product, a digital wallet, a yield-bearing token, or a safe reserve asset inside a platform they already trust. That is how debt gets socialized invisibly. The user thinks they adopted a better money tool. The platform thinks it found a profitable spread. The state thinks it found new demand for its obligations. That is debt upload. And it is far more elegant than begging the world to keep buying bonds out of habit. Now let us move to the fifth mechanism. I call it wallet capture. This is where convenience becomes political. Every major platform wants to live closer to your money, not because they love efficiency, because controlling payment rails is one of the most powerful business and governance positions in the world. That is wallet capture. If large corporations begin issuing dollar-linked digital balances, reward credits, stable value payment systems, or quasi-bank wallets backed by government debt, then money moves out of neutral cash, like behavior, and into corporate-governed, state-compatible channels. Your spending, saving, transfers, and rewards now sit inside systems where rules can be changed, access can be constrained, behavior can be nudged, and monetary privilege can be distributed selectively. This is where the ordinary person gets hypnotized. The app is easy. The rewards feel good. The yield looks attractive. The payments are seamless. Nothing feels coercive because the offer is convenient. That is precisely why it works. A controlled system that feels optional is stronger than one that arrives honestly as force. That is wallet capture. And once enough of life runs through those rails, monetary control no longer needs to arrive as old-fashioned censorship. It can arrive as settings, restrictions, scoring, compliance flags, transaction conditions, or simple invisibility when a wallet no longer behaves the way you expected it to. Now, let us move to the sixth mechanism. I call it programmable dependence. This is the part most people will dismiss as too extreme until it becomes normal enough to stop sounding strange. When money becomes digital inside tightly governed rails, the issuer gains more than settlement speed. It gains policy reach. That is programmable dependence. A programmable system can reward behavior, restrict uses, freeze access, prioritize some categories over others, deny some transfers, and create conditionality around what used to be a simple transaction. The public does not need to be told that control increased. All that is required is that the system becomes useful enough, common enough, and crisis justified enough that opting out feels impractical. That is the real trap. People imagine control as a dramatic switch. In reality, control usually arrives as a little more verification, a little more compliance, a little more integration, a little more convenience, a little less cash, a little less friction between government priorities and private balances. Eventually, the line between public monetary policy and personal transaction freedom becomes blurrier than it used to be. That is programmable dependence. And it will be sold not as domination, but as safety, inclusion, modernization, anti-fraud protection, and economic coordination. Now, let us move to the seventh mechanism. I call it asset exit. If money rails are becoming more controlled, what protects the ordinary person best is not panic. It is exit capacity. That is asset exit. You do not need a bunker mentality to see the value of holding part of your life outside systems that can be frozen, diluted, or reprogrammed too easily. Physical assets, real ownership, metals in direct possession, self-custody digital assets where appropriate and understood local networks, practical skills, cash where it still matters, diversification across institutions, real-world redundancy. This is not because every digital system is evil. It is because dependence without alternatives is weakness. The person with no exit is not participating. They are trapped. A controlled future becomes far more dangerous when citizens hold no independent stores of value and no independent channels of exchange or resilience. The point is not to abandon the modern system entirely. The point is to prevent your whole life from being uploaded into a structure whose rules can change faster than your freedom can adapt. That is asset exit. Now, I want to force the identity shift because without it, this still sounds like a theory video instead of a usable framework. Stop thinking like a spectator of monetary history. Start thinking like a sovereignty builder. A spectator asks whether the theory is exactly right in every detail. A sovereignty builder asks whether the direction of travel increases dependence or decreases. A spectator wants certainty. A sovereignty builder wants redundancy. A spectator waits for the official replacement of the dollar. A sovereignty builder notices how money can become more centralized long before the label changes. That is the stronger identity. Because once you think that way, the whole story becomes less about drama and more about preparation. You do not need perfect prophecy. You need directionally correct defenses, less dependence on one rail, more understanding of debt, yields, oil, and monetary control, more ownership of things that are hard to freeze, more skepticism when convenience and centralization arrive, wearing the same smile. And now let me give you the operating system plainly. First, watch debt and yields together. A reserve system becomes fragile when financing costs rise faster than the political system can tolerate. Second, take oil shocks seriously. Energy pressure can become a monetary crisis much faster than most people expect. Third, understand that rescue often means inflationary support. Saving the system today may still cost the public dearly tomorrow. Fourth, be suspicious when new digital money tools are backed by government debt and wrapped in corporate convenience. Ask who benefits from the structure, not just the feature list. Fifth, recognize that programmable money does not need to arrive with a scary name. It can arrive through rewards, wallets, stable tokens, and friendly interfaces. Sixth, hold part of your wealth in forms that increase your independence from controlled rails. Seventh, build local skills, networks, and practical resilience. Monetary systems are strongest where people are weakest and most dependent. That is the heart of it. The war may not replace the dollar in one cinematic move, but crisis can absolutely be used to evolve the dollar into a more centralized, more digitized, more controlled system than the public would have accepted under calm conditions. That is how power usually grows. Now let me end where this really matters. You can keep waiting for some official moment when they admit exactly what the new system is. You can keep assuming that convenience is neutral and that digital finance is just progress with better design. You can keep trusting that if control ever expanded too far, it would at least arrive honestly enough for everyone to notice before it mattered. Or you can do the harder thing. You can study the debt, you can study the yields, you can study the rails, you can own real assets, you can reduce dependence, you can treat sovereignty as something you build, not something the system automatically leaves you, and you can prepare for a world where the most important monetary shift is not what money is called, but who gets to set the conditions under which it works. That is the threshold, because the people least damaged by the next monetary transition will not be the ones who watch the most commentary. They will be the ones who quietly built enough independence that the new system could not fully close around them. That is the mirror. Look into it carefully. If all of your savings, payments, and future optionality still depend on rails you do not understand and cannot refuse, then whatever else is true, the upgrade path of power already includes you. The moment you begin building alternatives is the moment that changes.